Shabbat Shalom. It takes a lot of hubris to stand up and say, Judaism says, to state unequivocally what Judaism says or what Judaism believes. Luckily, I'm a rabbi, and we have a lot of hubris. And I have a Torah to back me up. And that Torah is very clear on the matter of life. Ha'idati bechem hayom et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz, God says in the book of Genesis, I call heaven and earth to witness to you this day, b'charta b'chaim l'ma'an tichya ata v'zarchecha. Choose life, that you and your offspring will live. The 5 books of Moses, the Torah, are the foundation of our religious verve. As Jews, we learn from the Torah this underpinning belief that we, us living people, are to choose life. This desire to live above almost all else guides our Jewish laws as well, our halakha. Breaking Shabbat used to be a capital offense. So you see how serious it was, knowing how much we value life. And yet, to save a life, one may break any and all of the laws of Shabbat. Light a fire, make some medicine, cook. Because as important as Shabbat is, living is more so. The debate over what happens when we die is a good example. Heaven, or is it Gehenna? Is it Olam Haba? There's no broad consensus. There's no unified Jewish theory of what comes next when you're no longer alive. Because, honestly, we don't really care, at least not nearly as much about that as we do about what we do now in our lives as living people. That's what we emphasize. That's what matters. That's what Judaism believes, and I have no problem saying that with all the rabbinic hubris I have. There is, of course, a corollary question that arises if we are to choose life. When does that life begin? The question of when does life begin is inherently, it is a religious question. Medically, it's not very straightforward. Is it when there's a heart? Is it when there's a heartbeat? Is it viability outside the womb? These all have different answers, and with a range of literally months between them. And honestly, I'm not very interested in that right now. Some folks, who share much of our same Bible, like to cite a very famous line from Jeremiah that guides how they believe when life begins. Before I created you in the womb, God says, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. And they interpret this line in a certain direction. God here is speaking to Jeremiah, very hesitant about taking on the role of being a prophet. Jeremiah is unsure of himself. Who is he to do this task? And God reassures him, saying that he has no reason to doubt himself, that he is who he was meant to be because God always knew what he would be. It's very beautiful. It's very beautifully written poetic words from our prophets and very superfluous to the discussion for Jews, for us Jews. Because we have our own religious definition as to when life begins, and it comes not from these later books, these prophets, but from the Torah itself, from the very story of creation. When God created Adam, the very first human being, and God breathed the breath of life into that very first person, Adam nefesh chaya, and that person became a living being. Our ancient and medieval rabbis, who then wrote the laws that we base our lives on now, base all of their writings on abortion, on these 2 fundamental ideas, that life is holy and to be preserved at all costs, and that life begins not at conception, not at fertilization, not at an electrical pulse beating, but at taking a breath. It is tempting, I must admit, to go on and on now, to detail how our rabbis 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago even, directly addressed abortion. And they did. They did. If you haven't read the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Rambam, what you see in there, our ancient and medieval rabbis spoke in very clear language about the status of what we now call a zygote or a fetus, about how only once a woman is in labor or a baby takes a breath, then and only then are we dealing with 2 distinct lives. If you haven't read this stuff, it might shock you. If you haven't read modern day, traditional, very traditional, orthodox psak, very religious, very traditional, classic men, they have very nuanced and complex opinions on maternal, physical, and mental health, on fetuses and abnormalities. If you haven't read what these very traditional men said, it might shock you. And if you're not familiar with modern Israeli law, the only law in the world based on Jewish Orthodox religious law, you can't have a civil wedding in Israel. You can't have a conservative or a reform wedding in Israel. There is a singular approach to religious law. And in Israel, one can procure an abortion without question in cases of maternal, mental, or physical or emotional health concerns, fetal health concerns, in any case of rape, incest, or adultery, if you are under 18 or over 40 or not married, and even if you don't fall into one of those categories, 96% of abortions are approved. And not just that, partially or fully subsidized. If you didn't know that about Israeli law, it might shock you. But I don't want to derail us. Jewish law, halakha, which as a religious Jewish person I strive to live my life by, shapes my viewpoints, make my choices, makes very clear that the life of the person who is pregnant, the mother, that is the life we prioritize, and it is ultimately her decision. In Jewish law, you may decline life-saving treatments and continue a pregnancy, even if you know your baby will outlive you, because you want your baby to be born, even at the risk of your own life. Jewish law says that's your choice, and you can make it. And you can make the very serious and often heart-wrenching decision to end a pregnancy. If you or that baby will suffer, sicken, or die, that's your choice too. And this is often left out of this discussion, but it's so common. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage, just naturally, without any outside influence. I don't think I know a woman who hasn't experienced that. And often, upon suffering a miscarriage, the body simply cannot expel what it must, and the treatment for that, medically, clinically, is abortion, without which you could well die. By ending the protection for anyone in this country to make the choice to secure an abortion, Jewish lives, lots of lives, are imperiled. Bacharta b'chaim, God tells us, choose life. But we are being told by others that we can't. How very un-American. This 4th of July weekend, we are celebrating the founding of this great nation and the brilliant and brave men who made it happen. Often, for the 4th of July, rabbis like to pull quotes from them. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and the nice things they said about Jews hundreds of years ago, putting them at odds with other thinkers and leaders at the time. For example, John Adams said Jews are, quote, the most essential instrument for civilizing nations. There you go. That Jewish thought has influenced the affairs of mankind more and happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. Thanks, John. That's sweet. Thomas Jefferson said, nothing is wiser than all our institutions should keep pace with the advance of time and be improved with the improvements of the human mind. He was writing about how Jews need to be included in higher education, but there were some theology requirements placed on them by these institutions. He said, I have thought it a cruel addition to the wrongs which that injured sect, he means us Jews, have suffered, that their youth should be excluded from the instructions in science afforded to all others in our public seminaries by imposing on them a course of theological reading which their consciences do not permit them to pursue. That's some enlightened stuff, right? That's nice. That's nice stuff. But it's become in vogue of late to diminish or even deride these kinds of statements and our founding fathers for making them. This opposition, it comes from a good place, I think. Declares, oh yeah, Adams, Jefferson, they said these nice things about Jews, all well and good, but in their private correspondence, they thought Jews should eventually just convert. They actually said they thought Jews were wrong. And to be honest, it's not untrue. Adams, Jefferson, they often said in their private letters, and we can see these, they have copies, that they didn't think Jewish theology was correct, that the Jewish interpretation of our shared Bible was the right way to do it. Jefferson actually said that our concept of God was cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust. Well, dang, Tom. I mean, I disagree. But that's the crux of it, right? Our founding fathers, they weren't lying. They did think positively of Jews, that we did good things in the world, that we should be included in all strata of society, and free to believe and practice as our conscience allowed. And they really didn't agree with our religious viewpoint, and that's okay. To our founding fathers, whose vision shaped this nation, America is meant to be a place of many viewpoints. We didn't have to agree with each other. In all likelihood, they knew we wouldn't, as long as there's room at the table for everyone. Those men who wrote our Constitution, they were smart. They could have made this a country with one religion, like so very many before it. But our founding fathers, they were not stupid. They chose purposefully not to do that, because they want America to be a land not where we all think and look and act the same, but a land where we agree and disagree and strive to love, or at least tolerate, each other through it all. Rabbi David Wolpe wrote that in last week's Torah portion, Shlach Lecha, we read about the story of the scouts sent to assess our land. We read the story, he says, of the future of a nation and a story of division. As you remember, there were some scouts who were sent out. They see the land, and some scouts look and see the land. They see fertile land, there's a bounty, and others look in, they see monsters waiting to devour us. Rabbi Wolpe says that we were reminded that members of the same community can peer into a land simultaneously, with some of them seeing monstrosities and others beauty. We read, he says, that our God pushes us past fear and toward hope, even when it seems lost, and towards creating the future, the land, and the nation we deserve and need. On the eve of the 246th birthday of this great country, and the end of a judicial decision allowing Jews and others to make a choice that saves lives, let us pray with the words of our mouths and the works of our hands that this land becomes more and more every day that which our founding fathers envisioned it to be. As George Washington wrote to Touro Synagogue a few years after the founding, his hopes that America would be for the Jews and others a land where everyone would sit in safety under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid. Shabbat Shalom, and may God continue to bless the United States of America.